It is Friday, August 17th. Let's talk PlayStation. Alright, so kind of a quiet news week for PlayStation. Not really a whole lot going on, but we do have 4 news stories that I want to talk about with you guys from this past week. Going into our first one, a very cool advertisement that Sony did in Manhattan, New York for Spider-Man, because it's coming out September 7th, very, very soon. But it is a fully decked out train in bright red with Spider-Man right on the front. You can see the PS4 logo on the bottom there. And then even the interior of this train was also decked out once again in complete red, even on the walls. The seats also, again, that pearlescent, beautiful little red, and you get that beautiful white Spider-Man logo on the seat. I mean, that just looks awesome. Definitely one of my favorite advertisements for sure. Another one that I can think of off the top of my head was, if you remember a long time ago, at least for a PlayStation advertisement, this was for Resistance 2. And if you remember, it's that famous Los Angeles hotel, always a spot for an advertisement. There's usually something on there at all times. And the Resistance 2 had the big Leviathan Chimera, and that was like a life-size version of the Leviathan back then. And that was always one of my favorite ones that I can at least think of from recent memory. Now moving on to the Uncharted movie, we actually have an update, and surprisingly, it's a promising update. The current director of the movie, Shawn Levy, and I say currently because this movie has exchanged hands so many times, but current director Shawn Levy had recently said that in regards to the Starman remake and the Uncharted movie, Uncharted is actually the one that seems to be closer to actually going into production, given that more people get attached to the project. But basically, he was quoted as saying, "I mean, as of right now, the closest to the starting line is Uncharted in that it's a massive title. We now have a very good script, and we have our star in Tom Holland that is now subject to schedule and additional casting. But I would say, as of right now, that seems to be the most near the horizon, and it's a movie I'm very excited about." So that's kind of slightly uplifting news. I know a lot of people are still a little upset because of that recent Uncharted fan film with Nathan Fillion, and he did play that really well to the point where, you know, like, oh man, he's got to be in the Uncharted movie. But we knew a long time ago that this movie was going to be an origin story of Drake, which is why you'd have a young Tom Holland playing a young Drake, and you'd have a young Sully, and the story would be a little bit of a jumping off point from there. And initially I didn't like that, but the more I sat on it, and then when I saw Spider-Man Homecoming, I thought, all right, this movie might have some ground to stand on, and it might actually turn out well. And that's like the most optimistic thing I can really say about it, because, let's face it, most video game movies usually suck. So, I mean, with the right people, I've said this a few times, with the right people, the right money, the right resources, passion to make it work, we can finally get a good video game movie. I would hope that it's this, but I'm still not really, I'm not really going to hold my breath for it. Now moving on to a crossplay news story. We haven't talked about crossplay in a few weeks, mostly because there's really nothing going on and Sony still won't do anything, but this past week, Bethesda's Pete Hines was talking about how it's an absolute necessity to have crossplay, and not Fallout 76, but actually the Elder Scrolls Legends, the strategy card game. So basically, Bethesda Pete Hines has said, he was quoted as saying, "It is our intention, in order for the game to come out, it has to be those things on any system. We cannot have a game that works one way across everywhere else except for on this one thing. The way the game works right now on Apple, Google, Steam, and Bethesda.net, it doesn't matter where you buy your stuff. If you play it on another platform, that stuff is there. It doesn't matter what platform you play on. You play against everyone else who's playing at that moment. There's no, oh, it's easier to control, or it has a better frame rate on this system. It's a strategy card game. It doesn't matter." I find this a little polarizing, because he even went out of his way to say that, you know, if Fallout 76 was crossplay with everything, that'd be great, but if it's a no, oh well. But this one, it's absolute necessity that this card game has to have crossplay. And he made a point to say that he's talked to everybody about this. He's not trying to single out Sony. He said he has to talk to Apple, Nintendo, Microsoft, everybody to make sure it works. But we all know, presumably, they're playing just fine, and we know that Sony's the odd man out, because Sony always says no. I guess he's sort of making his case of, like, that's what he's saying in that quote, like, it's a card game. Like, why can this not be crossplay? That's basically what he's trying to get at. But I guess it's really important to the team that this game, in every way, is able to be, like, he's basically saying it's all or nothing. Like, the game won't come out on PS4 if Sony won't allow this. And they're also saying that they're pretty much going along with development, assuming that Sony will allow it. He also said that they're talking to Sony every single day about this, and he made a particular point, which is that with this conversation with Sony, there are certain situations where Sony will say yes to something and they'll say no to other things. So that is kind of like a gray area where they can kind of work their way into possibly trying to make this work. It just sucks that Sony has to make this such, like, that Sony has to make this so difficult. I'm seeing more and more people now sympathize with Sony, which is a little odd to me because a lot of people are like, well, whatever, like, Sony doesn't want to do it, like, let's be over with it, like, oh, I don't need crossplay anyway. You shouldn't really have that attitude. We would want Sony to do this because it's a pro-consumer thing, and we want Sony to be that way. We don't want them to sort of slip into the same attitude of 2006 Sony with the PlayStation 3. We saw how that all worked out, and we really don't want them to be in that scenario again. I mean, is that really what we want, where they have this tight consumer leverage over us, where they're the market leader and they can do whatever they want? Because with this crossplay situation, that's why this is a big issue, because that's exactly what they're doing. They're leveraging control over consumers to sell more PlayStation 4s. Of course, it's understandable from their perspective as they're a business and they want to sell PS4s, but I think people should be putting their foot down on this and demand that Sony starts to change their mind on this. For our final news story, it's about PlayStation VR. Sony recently announced that PlayStation VR has hit 3 million units sold worldwide. And in relation to games, they actually said games and experiences, but games and experiences total has 21 million units sold. And, they say sold, which makes me think, all right, is that content that they paid for? Because if they're lumping experiences into that, there's a lot of free stuff on the PlayStation Store for PSVR, and that's what I'm like. There's a lot of experiences on there, like the Call of Duty Jackal mission, or there's just like a lot of apps on there that are like really small 5-minute things, but they're virtual reality. Like, are they including that, or are they including paid content? It'd be more impressive if it was paid content, but if it's free stuff, then that number is probably heavily diminished because, let's face it, a lot of people will download free stuff. And that's what you do when you get PlayStation VR or Vive or Oculus. You download all the free stuff because you just dropped a whole bunch of money on PlayStation VR. But anyway, let's kind of put this into perspective. And that's where this conversation is going to get tough, because there's no way to put that into perspective, because 3 million may seem low to a lot of people, and it actually is low if you look at Sony's internal projections and what a lot of analysts were thinking. It does seem low, but at the same time, PlayStation VR is still technically the market leader for premium VR. And if we're talking about premium VR, that does include Oculus and Vive. Those two headsets still have a higher barrier of entry if we are including the fact that you need a higher end PC for them. I mean, yeah, Oculus, the actual headset itself, is pretty much leveled out in terms of price with PSVR, but you still need a higher end PC, and you can't really beat going out to a store and buying a PS4 for around $250 at most stores. And it always comes with an extra gamer controller. Like, there's tons of retailer bundles going around. Usually PS4 MSRPs for $300, but still, there's usually a sale. So that's the thing. 3 million seems, low, because a long time back, before PSVR came out. PSVR came out October 2016, so a few months prior to that, there was a lot of analysts saying that it was going to sell anywhere from 5 to 6 million within the first year, and it wasn't even close to that. Sony admitted not that long ago, maybe a year ago now, that their internal projections were missed and that VR adoption was at a much slower rate than they anticipated, which I'm sure is troubling news to the company. But at the same time, Sony has also vocally admitted on numerous occasions that this is a version 1 of the device, and they are committing to this long term. They know that this is version 1 of PlayStation VR, and that there's possibly going to be a version 2, version 3. We already have rumors suggesting that PlayStation 5 is going to have VR technology baked right into the box, which would imply that possibly the current PlayStation VR processing box, which is used to output the image back on the television, that might be built right into the PlayStation 5. So that's the interesting point, is that long term, where is this going to be? Because Sony does still want to commit to VR, I'm sure, and they know that the adoption's slow as it is right now, but that's why it's hard to put it in perspective, because would you call PlayStation VR a failure right now? I think most people would, but I'm not sure if that's really a fair assessment given the fact that it's so early in the start of it, right? Yes, this is its own hardware, and it's at retailers with games, but that's the constant conversation about VR, is that it has so much potential, and it really does when you start to consider all the extra input methods, omnidirectional flooring. I mean, there's a lot of ways where it can go. When you have more powerful hardware in the future, 5, 10 plus years from now, it'll be a far cry from where we're at right now, and it might be a more desirable piece of technology for people to go out and buy. At the same time, it's still a high barrier of entry. That's why it's hard to put that 3 million in perspective, because we've never really had and it's not really a peripheral, but for lack of a better word, we've never really had a peripheral that was this astronomically high. PlayStation VR came out at $400. That's a lot of money for a device that doesn't even work unless you have another device. So 3 million units, I mean, at $400 retail, I mean, that's still pretty... I mean, granted, it's cheaper now, $200. PlayStation VR has been as low as $250, which you would hope that sold a lot more units. But the last time we got a sales figure was... you know what, I can't even say it off the top of my head because I don't remember. It seems like it was maybe a year ago that they were at like 2 million something, but I don't remember for sure. So yeah, I mean, it's low. Sony has said that it's low. It's way off the mark from analysts, but it's when you know that they're going to be doing this long term, maybe you consider it a failure now, but it might not be in the future, given that Sony is putting so much R&D and effort into it. They probably are really hoping that this will be a very big thing in 10 years, and presumably it will be if everything goes according to plan, and that's what we were talking about. If locomotion gets figured out better, if motion sickness gets figured out, if we get big peripherals like that omnidirectional tracking for feet, start getting those, there's been Kickstarters and concept gloves that make you feel weight in your hand and things like, you know what I mean? Things like that, that's super long term. I mean, that's far out, but that kind of stuff's going to be really engaging. And, Sony's been making a lot of decisions recently that show that they're thinking about the long term. Something like PlayStation Now, they know that's a long term thing. The very x86 PC architecture of PS4, they knew that was a long-term thing because PS4 Pro is proof of that. PS5 will likely be more proof of that when it will likely be announced with backwards compatibility because it's still using x86. They make decisions that are going to last them 10 plus years. They really don't want to, slip up anymore with their breadwinner, and their breadwinner is PlayStation. So they want to make PlayStation VR something big in the future. It's not right now, but maybe it will be. Those are some of the news stories that I want to talk about with you guys from this past week. So I didn't have a new video for you earlier this week, but this come Monday or Tuesday will be a new video for sure. I say Monday, Tuesday because I don't know specifically which day, because just how my work schedule pans out, but expect a new video coming up. And I'm getting very close to wrapping up our next documentary. If you didn't see it yet, check out the first one. It was the PlayStation Vita documentary. Hook your boy up, share that around, because, it took me so long to make that video, so I'm sorry. I'm going to keep pimping it out. But otherwise, the next one's coming up very soon. So that's pretty much it. That concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you guys next Friday.